It is Monday, March 27th, 1972. The location is the United California Bank in Laguna, Niguel, a quiet, affluent coastal community in Orange County. The sun is barely up, casting long, sharp shadows against the white stucco exterior of the bank. This is a story of precision, of a crime so perfectly executed that it would eventually be undone only by the sheer weight of bureaucratic paperwork. But right now, at this exact moment, the crime is just a silent room filled with dust. The manager, a man named Earl, turns his key in the heavy front door. He disables the perimeter alarm. He expects the routine hum of the ventilation system and the smell of floor wax. Instead, he is hit by a wall of humid, chalky air. It smells of sulfur, pulverized stone, and stale sweat. He walks toward the vault. The massive steel door, a circular masterpiece of engineering intended to keep the world out, is locked. It looks untouched. He spins the dial, listening for the tumblers to click into place. They do. He swings the door open. Inside, the world has been turned upside down. This is the largest bank burglary in United States history. Over $30 million in cash and valuables are gone, and the men who took it are already ghosts. Special Agent Earl Devaney of the FBI arrived at the scene less than an hour after the local police secured the perimeter. Devaney was a man who lived his life in the details. He did not run. He walked with a measured gait, his eyes scanning the floor before his feet touched it. He was wearing a grey suit that seemed to absorb the dim light of the bank's interior. He flashed his credentials to the uniformed officer at the door and ducked under the yellow tape. The scene inside the vault was a testament to violence committed against architecture. The floor was covered in inches of grey dust and rubble. Hundreds of safety deposit boxes had been pried open, their metal doors twisted like scrap tin. Papers, bonds, and empty jewelry boxes were scattered in drifts, looking like snow in the harsh light of the forensic lamps. Devaney stopped at the threshold. He pulled a pair of latex gloves from his pocket and snapped them on. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. He wasn't looking at the empty boxes yet. He was looking at the ceiling. There, directly through the 18-inch reinforced concrete roof of the vault, was a hole. It was ragged at the edges but perfectly positioned. It wasn't just a breach, it was a statement. Quote 0, Devaney said, his voice flat and authoritative. Quote 1. A local detective standing near the back wall nodded. Devaney stepped carefully over a pile of discarded legal documents. He approached the vault walls. To understand the crime, he had to understand the container. The United California Bank vault was considered impenetrable. The walls were 12 inches of concrete, laced with dense steel rebar. The door was a Mosler-timed lock, heat-sensitive and sound-sensitive. The interior was lined with microphones wired directly to the Laguna Niguel police station. If someone sneezed in here after hours, a squad car should have been rolling within 30 seconds. Yet, a crew of men had spent the entire weekend inside this room. They had drilled, hammered, and blasted, and the police board had remained silent. Devaney crouched down, examining the wiring near the floor. He traced the line of the microphone cables. They were intact. He stood up and looked at the alarm bell box mounted high on the wall outside the vault, which he had inspected upon entry. It had been filled with a hardening industrial foam, muffling the clapper, so that even if it had triggered, it would have vibrated silently in a tomb of expanding polyurethane. Devaney murmured, more to himself than the detective. He looked back at the hole in the roof. The light from the room above, the bank's conference room, filtered down through the jagged aperture. Devaney said. He walked to the center of the room, avoiding the piles of debris. He picked up a discarded tool lying near a gutted safety deposit box. It was a pry bar, heavy and black. He turned it over in his hands. No serial number. Clean. But not new. It had wear marks. Devaney said. He gestured to the rows of devastated containers. Devaney felt the familiar weight of the case settling onto his shoulders. The press would be here soon. The director would be calling. $30 million. The magnitude was staggering. But Devaney pushed the panic down. He replaced it with procedure. He took out his notebook. Item 1. Method of entry. Roof breach. Explosives involved. Item 2. Alarm bypass. Foam injection. Electronic suppression. Item 3. Duration. Weekend timeline. Estimated 48 hours inside. He looked at the rubble again. He ordered. To understand the whole, one had to understand the mind of Emil Dincio. The mastermind of the operation was not present in the room, having fled the state hours ago, but his psychological fingerprint was everywhere. Emil was a man who viewed bank vaults not as fortresses, but as puzzles designed by men who were less patient than he was. The forensic team moved in, setting up grids. They began to excavate the debris pile beneath the hole. What they found began to paint a picture of the technique. They recovered blackened fragments of metal and traces of a chemical residue. Devaney watched as a technician swabbed the edge of a piece of rebar that had been sheared off. The technician said. Devaney asked. The technician pointed to the rim of the hole in the ceiling. Devaney craned his neck. He saw it now. The hole wasn't a single blast crater. It was a series of interconnected circles. They drilled a circle of holes, Devaney realized. Core drilling. Then they packed the holes with explosive. Exactly, the technician said. They created a perforation like a stamp. Then they used a small charge to pop the plug of concrete out. It dropped right here. He pointed to a large slab of concrete resting on top of the debris pile. It was roughly 18 inches in diameter. Devaney looked at the slab. It was heavy, maybe 200 pounds. They caught it, he said. Sir? They didn't just let it drop, Devaney said, visualizing the scene. If this slab hits the floor from 12 feet up, the vibration triggers the seismic sensors in the floor. They lowered it, or they caught it in a sling. He looked around the room. In the corner, crumpled against a wall, was a heavy canvas tarp and some nylon rope. James, Devaney whispered. He didn't know the name yet, but he recognized the archetype. Emil Dincio was the architect, but he needed a mechanic, someone who understood the tensile strength of rope and the precise amount of explosive needed to cut steel without shattering the building's structural columns. The team continued to sift. They found drill bits, not the standard bits you could buy at a hardware store. These were industrial grade, tipped with tungsten carbide. They were burned out, their edges dulled by the relentless friction of drilling through 18 inches of concrete, reinforced with steel rods. Bag those separately, Devaney commanded. I want the manufacturer, the distributor, and every store in California that sells them. It's a common brand, sir, the detective noted. Hilti, or Black & Decker Industrial. I don't care if they sell them at the grocery store, Devaney snapped, his calm facade cracking for a microsecond. Find out who bought 20 of them in the last week. The investigation moved from the center of the room to the periphery. The thieves had brought a lot of gear, and in their haste to leave, or perhaps in their arrogance, they had left some of it behind. A technician near the back of the vault called out, Agent Devaney, you need to see this. Devaney walked over. The technician was pointing at the floor near the rear wall, away from the debris of the entry hole. Mud, the technician said. Devaney looked closer. Smears of dried earth were tracked across the linoleum floor of the vault. It rained on Friday, the detective offered. Maybe they tracked it in. Devaney knelt, bringing his face inches from the floor. He took a pen and scraped a tiny flake of the dried mud onto a piece of paper. He rubbed it between his gloved fingers. It was gritty, but fine, silty. It rained, Devaney acknowledged, but look at the color. The soil outside the bank, the landscaping, it's dark topsoil, mulch. This is grey, clay-heavy. He stood up and walked to the wall where the safe deposit boxes had been pried open. There were faint smudges of the same grey dust on the metal facings. This didn't come from the planter beds outside, Devaney said, and it didn't come from the roof. The roof is tar and gravel. Where did it come from? The technician asked. Devaney looked at the drill bits, then at the hole, and finally back at the mud. It came from where they were staging, where they were sleeping. He turned to the room. These men didn't fly in, rob the bank and fly out in one night. This, he gestured to the hole in the ceiling, took hours of drilling. The noise would have been deafening inside the room, even if they muffled it. They had to work in shifts. They had to take breaks. He began to pace, his mind constructing a timeline. They were here all weekend, Devaney said. They entered Friday night or Saturday morning. They bypassed the alarm. They drilled the holes. They blew the plug. They dropped in. They spent the next 24 hours popping boxes. They needed food. They needed water. They needed to sleep. He looked at the mud again. They weren't staying in a hotel, Devaney concluded. You don't track clay mud into a hotel lobby without the maid noticing. And you don't clean heavy industrial drills in a Holiday Inn bathroom. He paused, a theory crystallizing in his mind. The precision of the alarm bypass suggested inside knowledge, but the mud suggested a local footprint. They rented a house, Devaney said. Somewhere nearby, somewhere secluded, somewhere with a garage where they could prep their equipment and not be seen. The initial theory, that a bank employee had sold the alarm codes, began to recede in Devaney's mind. An inside man would have just given them the combination to the door. This crew had broken in the hard way. The alarm bypass wasn't a code, it was a physical disablement. They had filled the bell box with foam. That meant they had climbed the wall outside before they ever entered the building. Devaney walked back to the center of the vault. He looked at the devastation. It was a professional hit, yes, but professionals were creatures of habit. They relied on systems, and systems left paper trails. We need to check the flight manifests, Devaney said, his voice regaining its rhythmic cadence. These guys aren't from Laguna, Niguel. They're heavy hitters. Midwest, maybe. East Coast. They flew in, which means they rented cars. They rented a house. He pointed to the pry bar. And they bought tools. They didn't fly with 50 pounds of dynamite and 3-foot drill bits. They bought them here. The detective scribbled in his notebook. Hardware stores, realty listings for short-term rentals, car rental agencies at LAX and John Wayne. And the mud, Devaney added. Get the geologists on this. I want to know exactly where in Orange County you find this specific composition of grey clay. If we find the soil, we find the safe house. As the forensic team continued their work, bagging the evidence of the greatest burglary in history, Devaney stepped out of the vault and back into the bank lobby. The air was cleaner here, smelling of coffee and fear, as the bank employees huddled in the corner, questioned by officers. Devaney looked through the glass doors at the sunny California street. The thieves were gone. They had a 36-hour head start. But they had made a mistake. They had assumed that once they left the vault, their connection to it was severed. They were wrong. They were connected to this room by the mud on their shoes, by the drill bits they had purchased, and by the flight tickets they had used to come here. Devaney adjusted his tie. The calm, methodical hunt had begun. He didn't need to be faster than them, he just needed to be thorough. The vault was a puzzle they had solved. Now, Devaney had to solve the puzzle of the men themselves. He turned back to the detective. Devaney said, glancing one last time at the dark mouth of the vault. He paused, the gravity of the implications sinking in. Devaney said, the realization shifted the ground beneath the investigation. This wasn't just a burglary, it was an architectural exploit. And somewhere in the sprawling suburbs of Southern California, there was a house that held the secrets to the crime. A house where the mud on the floor would match the mud in the vault. Devaney pushed through the revolving doors, the blast of conditioned air giving way to the oppressive, dry heat of the afternoon. The sunlight was blinding, bouncing off the chrome bumpers of the black and whites, angled haphazardly along the curb. He squinted, putting on a pair of aviators that hid the fatigue lining his eyes. Miller, Devaney said, not looking back, knowing the younger detective was right on his heels. You drive. I need to think. Detective Miller, a man whose ambition was currently outpacing his experience, jogged around to the driver's side of their unmarked sedan. He unlocked the doors, the mechanism thunking heavily in the heat. As they slid into the baking interior, Miller cranked the engine and the air conditioning roared to life, blowing hot dust before settling into a lukewarm breeze. City Hall? Miller asked, his hands gripping the wheel at 10 and 2. Planning department, Devaney confirmed. And call the lab. Tell them I want that soil analysis prioritized above the governor's autograph. I want to know the mineral content, the particulate size, the age, everything. If there's a microfossil in that mud, I want to know its Latin name and what it ate for breakfast 1,000,000 years ago." Miller merged into the sluggish traffic, the radio crackling with the chaotic dispatch of the perimeter units, still searching for a white van that Devaney knew was long gone. The van was a ghost. It had likely been torched in a ravine or wiped down with bleach and abandoned in a long-term parking lot at LAX hours ago. The physical getaway was over. The intellectual chase was the only thing left.
Devaney leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes. He visualized the vault, the clean lines of the cut. The thermal lance work on the hinges had been surgical, but the drilling, that was the tell. To drill blindly into a bank wall was suicide. You hit a power line, you die. You hit a water main, you drown the operation. You hit a reinforced I-beam, you break your bit and make enough noise to wake the dead. These men hadn't hit anything but concrete and the soft steel of the inner lining.
Devaney murmured, half to himself. Miller glanced over. They arrived at the municipal complex 20 minutes later, a brutalist concrete fortress that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. The planning department was in the basement, a fluorescent-lit purgatory of rolling metal shelves and the smell of oxidizing paper and stale coffee. Devaney flashed his badge at the counter. The clerk, a woman named Mrs. Gable, who looked as though she had been archived along with the documents, peered over her spectacles. Devaney said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. Mrs. Gable sighed, a sound like shifting parchment. Devaney leaned over the counter, placing both hands flat on the formica. He didn't raise his voice. He dropped it. "Ma'am, $30 million just walked out of that building. The men who took it used information stored in this room. Now, either you open that logbook, or I designate this entire basement a crime scene, tape off the doors, and have a forensic team dust every single file folder for the next 3 weeks, while you explain to the city controller why no permits can be issued until Christmas." Mrs. Gable held his gaze for a second, then blinked. She turned to her computer, her fingers clacking loudly. "Access logs are digitized since '98. Hard copies before that." "Just give me the list," Miller said, stepping up beside Devaney, trying to mirror his partner's intensity, but landing somewhere near impatience. The printer whirred. Mrs. Gable tore off the sheet and slid it across the counter. Devaney snatched it up. His eyes scanned the list. Architects, city inspectors, retrofitting contractors. Most were routine, seismic upgrades, HVAC repairs. And then his finger stopped. "Here," Devaney said, tapping a line near the bottom. 3 months ago, AV Architects. Request for structural load-bearing schematics for the basement and foundation levels. Purpose: proposed heavy safe installation. "Sounds legitimate," Miller shrugged. "The bank puts in new safes." "The bank didn't request it," Devaney said, his mind racing. "The requester is listed as John Varker. I know the bank manager. He's been trying to cut costs for 2 years. He wouldn't authorize a new heavy safe installation, and he certainly wouldn't hire an outside firm nobody's ever heard of to check the floor loads." "Varker," Miller repeated, pulling out his notebook. "I'll run it." "It's an alias, Miller. Varker, Parker, Starker. It doesn't matter. What matters is the date. May 12th. They were here on May 12th. Ask Mrs. Gable if they viewed the physical blueprints or digital copies." Mrs. Gable checked the screen. Physical. They requested the original large format rolls, said they needed to measure the scale accurately. "Did they make copies?" "We don't allow copies of security-sensitive blueprints," Mrs. Gable said primly. "They can only view them at the table over there." She pointed to a long, scarred oak table in the corner, illuminated by a humming light box. Devaney walked over to the table. He ran his hand along the wood. They sat here. They unrolled the plans. They couldn't photocopy them. They couldn't take pictures, too suspicious with staff watching. He looked at the surface of the table. They traced them. Devaney bent down, bringing his eye level with the table surface. "Miller, give me your flashlight." Miller handed over a small tactical light. Devaney clicked it on and raked the beam horizontally across the wood grain of the table. There, faint but undeniable, were the indentations, ghostly white lines where a heavy hand had pressed down with a stylus or a hard pencil, driving through the tracing paper and scarring the varnish of the table beneath. Tracing paper, Devaney whispered. Old school, reliable, no digital trail. He stood up, snapping the light off. Bag this table. The whole table? Miller stammered. The whole table. Saw the legs off if you have to. I want the lab to use oblique lighting and electrostatic lifts to recover the indentations. If we can map what they traced, we can see exactly what route they planned. But more importantly, if they were leaning on this table for hours, they left something else. Prints? Maybe, but definitely sweat, skin cells, DNA. Devaney turned back to Mrs. Gable, who looked horrified at the prospect of losing her furniture. Do you have security cameras in here? Only at the entrance, she whispered. Get the tapes, Devaney ordered Miller. I want to see the face of the man who likes to draw. By the time they left City Hall, the sun was dipping lower, casting long, bruised shadows across the sprawl of the city. The radio in the car chirped. Devaney, he answered. It's Thorne. A rasping voice came over the speaker. The geologist. You get me the best mud in town, Devaney. This stuff is a gourmet meal. What do you have, Aris? Okay, so the base is standard silty clay, typical for the basin. But, the geologist paused for dramatic effect. The aggregate mixed in is very specific. I found high concentrations of diatomaceous earth and traces of marine shale that hasn't been fully compacted. Plus, and this is the kicker, trace amounts of eucalyptus pollen and, wait for it, pulverized terracotta. Devaney stared out the window at the passing strip malls. Terracotta? Like pots? Like roof tiles, Devaney. Old ones. But the soil composition, this specific marine shale, it's not from the bank's location. The bank is built on alluvial plain deposits. This mud came from higher up, the foothills. Devaney's mind began to overlay maps. Which foothills? The chemical signature matches the Silverado Formation, specifically the western ridge where the canyon meets the residential shelf, and the eucalyptus pollen suggests a grove, likely a windbreak planted in the 50s. You're looking for a construction site or a property with exposed earth in the Tustin or Orange foothills area. And the terracotta? It's dust, Devaney. Someone was cutting tiles, a lot of them, or crushing them. Devaney hung up the mic. Turn the car around, Miller. Where to? North, toward the hills. We're looking for a house. A house? Based on pollen and roof tiles?
Based on the profile, Devaney said, his voice sharpening. Think about it. They need a place to prep, a place to store the dynamite, the drills, a place to park the van where neighbors won't ask questions. They need privacy, a garage. But they also need to blend in. He gestured to the windshield. Suburbs, the best camouflage in the world. But they made a mess. They tracked that mud into the bank, which means they were walking in it right before they left. The safe house has an unpaved yard, or a construction zone. A remodel, Miller realized, his eyes widening. The terracotta dust. They rented a house that was undergoing roof repairs? Or they posed as contractors?
Exactly, Devaney said. Get onto the real estate listings. Look for short-term rentals in the Tustin foothills. Specifically, look for properties listed as under renovation or secluded. Cross-reference that with the date they picked up the blueprints. They would have secured the base of operations first. Miller drove with one hand, typing awkwardly into the laptop mounted on the dash with the other. Okay, Tustin foothills. Rentals. 3 to 6 months lease. Filtering by private and garage. The computer pinged. I've got 40 listings. Narrow it down, Devaney commanded. Look for a cash payment or a corporate lease paid up front. These guys don't run credit checks.
Okay, that drops it to 12. Wait, here's one. Miller slowed the car. 11,204 Skyline Drive. Leased 4 months ago to a Pacific Holdings LLC. Paid 6 months in advance. Listed as a fixer-upper. Owner was selling, but the market tanked, so he rented it out. Notes say, roof replacement pending material delivery. Roof replacement,
Devaney repeated. Terracotta dust. And the tenant notes, tenant requested permission to install upgraded security system at own cost. Devaney smiled, a cold, predatory tightening of his lips. That's them. They wanted to make sure no one broke in while they were planning how to break in. It's 20 minutes from here, Miller said, hitting the siren. The wail pierced the evening air, and the traffic parted like the Red Sea. The house on Skyline Drive was perched on a ridge overlooking the valley, isolated from its neighbors by a thick wall of eucalyptus trees that swayed in the evening wind. The driveway was steep, curving up to a sprawling, ranch-style home that had seen better days. Pallets of red clay roof tiles were stacked in the side yard, covered in tarps that flapped loosely. Devaney signaled for the silent approach. 2 patrol cars cut their engines at the bottom of the hill. The SWAT team was 5 minutes out, but Devaney wasn't waiting for the door kickers. He wanted to see the shell before the pearl was completely gone. He and Miller moved up the driveway, weapons drawn, keeping to the shadows of the eucalyptus windbreak. The air smelled of menthol and dry grass. The house was dark, not just sleeping dark, but abandoned dark. There was a hollowness to it that Devaney could feel in his bones. Miller whispered, checking the side windows. Devaney approached the garage door. He knelt down. There, on the concrete lip of the driveway, was a faint smear of grey clay. He touched it. It was dry, crusted. He moved to the side door of the garage. It was locked, but the wood of the jamb was splintered near the handle, not from a break-in, but from a hasty exit where someone had jammed a bolt too hard. Devaney holstered his weapon and pulled a lockpick set from his pocket. 10 seconds later, the tumbler clicked. He pushed the door open. The smell hit them first. Acetone, machine oil, and the sharp metallic tang of cut steel. Devaney clicked his flashlight on. The beam cut through the gloom of the garage. It was a workshop, but not for woodworking or classic cars. Along the back wall, workbenches were lined with drill presses and grinders. The floor was swept, but in the cracks of the concrete, the evidence screamed. Metal shavings, tiny, curly spirals of high-grade steel that glittered like diamonds in the flashlight beam. Miller said, his voice hushed. In the center of the garage, the floor had been taped off with blue painter's tape. It formed a perfect rectangle. Inside the rectangle, someone had drawn schematics in chalk on the concrete floor. Devaney walked over, stepping carefully over the lines. He looked down at the diagram. "It's the vault," Devaney said. "Scale 1:1. He walked the perimeter of the tape. "Here's the door." He took 3 steps. "Here's the primary lock mechanism." He moved to the spot where, in the real bank, the thieves had drilled their hole. On the garage floor, right at that spot, was a heavy block of concrete. It had been drilled through. A test run. "They built a mock-up," Miller said, astounded. "They practiced." "They didn't just practice," Devaney corrected, moving to the workbench. He picked up a discarded invoice. "They scientifically engineered the crime." He shone the light on the wall above the bench. Pinned there were maps, not of the city, but of the sewer lines and electrical grids. And next to them, a calendar. Dates were crossed off in red marker. The last date crossed off was yesterday. "They're gone, sir," Miller said, looking around the empty space. "Cleaned out." "Not clean enough," Devaney said. He walked into the main house. The living room was sparse. A few folding chairs, a card table. On the table, a pile of takeout menus and a receipt. Devaney picked it up with a gloved hand. It was a receipt from a local hardware store, dated 2 days ago. Acetylene tanks, 3/4-inch diamond tip bits, duct tape. "We have the time," Devaney said. "We have the location. Now we track the purchases." He walked through the house, his mind assembling the lives of the men who had lived here. They were disciplined. They ate cheap food but bought expensive tools. They slept on camping cots. He saw the indentations in the carpet in the bedrooms, but drove high-end rentals. In the bathroom, Devaney found the mistake he had been hoping for. The sink was stained with hair dye, brown. One of them changed his appearance before the hit, Devaney called out. "Or after. Scrape the drain. I want the DNA." He walked back out to the garage, standing in the center of the chalk outline. He closed his eyes, imagining the men working here, the sound of the drill, the tension,
The focus.
They felt safe here, Devaney said softly. They thought the distance from the bank protected them. They didn't realize that the mud on their boots was a GPS tracker. Miller came in from the kitchen. "Sir, I found something in the trash they tried to burn in the fireplace. It's partially charred, but it looks like a flight itinerary." Devaney turned, his coat flaring. "Read it." "It's mostly ash, but I can make out a destination code. LHR. And a partial name. S. Vank." "London Heathrow," Devaney said. "And Vance. Simon Vance? Sebastian Vance? If they flew out of LAX yesterday, they're already in England." "Or they want us to think they are," Devaney countered. "You don't leave a burnable itinerary in the fireplace unless you're sloppy or you're planting a lead. These men aren't sloppy."
He looked at the test block of concrete again.
"They drilled this to test the density. They knew the bank's concrete had a specific aggregate mixture. Where did they get this concrete block?" He knelt by the block.
It wasn't a standard paver. It was a core sample,
A cylinder of concrete roughly 8 inches in diameter. Devaney said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Miller stared at him. Devaney realized the sheer audacity of the crime expanding in his mind. He stood up, energized. Devaney explained. He walked to the garage door and looked out at the lights of the city twinkling below. The smog turned the sunset into a bruised purple haze. Somewhere out there the men were moving. They were smart, yes, but they were arrogant. Their need for perfection, the test block, the blueprints, the specialized house, was the very thing that created the trail. Devaney listed. Miller asked. Devaney said,
turning back to the darkness of the garage.
He pointed to the corner of the garage where a stack of empty beer bottles sat. Imported. Expensive. Devaney buttoned his jacket. Miller holstered his gun, looking at the chalk outline of the vault one last time. Devaney said, stepping out into the cooling night air. As the sirens of the approaching forensics team wailed up the canyon, cutting through the silence of the hills, Devaney took a deep breath of the eucalyptus-scented air. He didn't feel the exhaustion anymore. He felt the cold, hard clarity of the hunt. The mud had spoken. The house had whispered its secrets. Now it was time to make the ghosts appear. "Let's go," Devaney said, walking toward the car. "I want to know who Varka really is before the sun comes up." The investigation had shifted gears. It was no longer about what was taken. It was about the sheer, terrifying brilliance of how it was done. And Devaney knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut like lead, that he wasn't just chasing criminals. He was chasing a mirror image of himself. Men who looked at the world and saw only structures, weaknesses, and the precise application of pressure. The engine roared to life, and the sedan turned back toward the city, descending into the grid of lights where the game would continue. The vault was open, but the trap was just beginning to close. Devaney dropped the heavy Sanborn map onto the hood of the sedan. The paper was thick, smelling of old ink and government storage. He uncapped a red marker and drew a tight circle around the United California Bank building. Devaney said, his voice flat. The circle encompassed the rolling hills of Laguna Niguel, a quiet, affluent sprawl of Spanish-tiled roofs and winding driveways. Devaney countered. Devaney looked up from the map, scanning the ridges surrounding the bank. The burglary had been surgical. The perpetrators had entered through the roof, bypassed the alarm, and spent the entire weekend inside the vault. They had emptied safe deposit boxes with an industrial efficiency that suggested military training or a lifetime of practice. This wasn't a smash and grab. It was an occupation. "We split the grid," Devaney ordered. "I want every short-term rental agency in South Orange County contacted within the hour. We aren't looking for a hotel. Hotels have maids. Hotels have lobbies. These men needed a garage. They needed privacy to prep the explosives. Look for furnished townhouses, leases signed in cash, tenants who didn't haggle." Miller nodded, pulling a notepad from his pocket. "What about the bank staff? The The alarm bypass theory?
We run it, Devaney said, folding the map.
But don't get married to it. The alarm wasn't bypassed because someone had the code. It was bypassed because someone filled the bell box with expanding foam. That's mechanics, not treachery. Start with the realtors. The investigation moved from the physical wreckage of the vault into the dry, fluorescent-lit world of administration. The crime scene was chaos. The hunt was geometry. Devaney returned to the temporary command center established in the local FBI field office. The room was a whirlwind of ringing phones and clacking typewriters, but Devaney carved out a silent space at a corner desk. He had the flight manifests. If the crew wasn't local to California, and Devaney was increasingly certain they weren't, they had to have flown in. The sheer weight of the equipment required for the job suggested they had driven the tools, but the men themselves would have moved faster. He pulled the stack of passenger lists from the major airlines servicing LAX and John Wayne Airport. April, May, June. Thousands of names. He began the process of elimination. He wasn't looking for criminals yet. He was looking for patterns, groups of men traveling together, tickets purchased sequentially, return dates that aligned with the Monday morning after the heist. His finger traced down the column of a United Airlines manifest from Youngstown, Ohio. Youngstown. The location nagged at him. It was a steel town, a hard town. It was also a hub for a specific kind of organized crime that specialized in safecracking. The alarm disablement technique, the foam, had been seen in a botched attempt in Ohio 2 years prior. He circled 3 names. They were generic: Smith, Jones, Brown. But they were seated in row 4, seats A, B, and C. Devaney called out without looking up. Miller jogged over, holding a sheaf of fax paper. Devaney said, tapping the paper. Miller said, placing the fax on top of the flight manifest. Devaney picked up the fax. Then stood up. The name meant nothing, which meant it was an alias, but the timeline was perfect. The drive to Pheasant Ridge was silent. The landscape of Laguna Niguel was manicured and serene, a stark contrast to the violence of the theft. The rows of townhouses looked identical: beige stucco, terracotta tiles, neatly trimmed hedges. It was the perfect camouflage. In a neighborhood where everyone looked the same, no one looked closely at anyone else. Devaney visualized the crew. He imagined Amil Dincio, the man the intelligence reports called a ghost. Dincio was known for his discipline. He wouldn't have been partying. He wouldn't have been loud. He would have run that townhouse like a submarine, tight, quiet, and purposeful. They pulled up to Unit 14B. It sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, backed against a steep hillside covered in eucalyptus. Private, secure. Devaney put on his gloves before he even exited the car. He told Miller. Miller worked the lock. It clicked open in 10 seconds. The air inside was stale. It held the faint, chemical scent of cleaning fluids. Devaney stepped onto the plush carpet. He stood still, listening. The house was empty, but it felt recently abandoned. The vibrations of occupancy were still settling. Devaney whispered. They moved methodically. Living room, clear. Dining room, clear. The place was spotless. The furniture was aligned with military precision. There were no magazines on the coffee table, no stray receipts, no footprints on the carpet. The vacuum lines were visible, tracking straight back to the closet. Miller said, coming out of the master bedroom. Devaney walked to the sliding glass door that looked out over the hills. He looked at the view. From here you could see the valley. You could probably see the roof of the bank if you had binoculars. This was the command post. Devaney said softly. Devaney turned back to the room. Perfection was impossible. That was the first rule of forensics. No matter how disciplined the mind, the physical world was messy. Entropy always won. A hair falls. A drop of sweat lands. A memory fails. Devaney said. He walked into the kitchen. The counters were gleaming white laminate. The sink was dry and polished. The stove burners had been removed, cleaned, and replaced. Devaney opened the refrigerator. Empty. Wiped down. He opened the pantry. Empty. Miller said from the hallway.
Devaney muttered. He stood in the center of the kitchen, closing his eyes. He tried to think like James Dincio, the brother, the explosive expert. James was tactile. He worked with his hands. After a long night of drilling through reinforced concrete, after hauling heavy bags of money, you come back here. You're exhausted. You're running on adrenaline and caffeine. You clean up. You pack the bags. You wipe the prints. But do you check everything? Devaney looked at the dishwasher. It was a standard white model, built into the cabinetry. Devaney said. Devaney hooked his finger into the latch of the dishwasher door, using the very edge of his nail to avoid the flat surface. He pulled it open. The rack slid out with a metallic rattle. The interior was dry. It smelled of detergent. The bottom rack was empty. Devaney pulled the top rack. It was mostly empty. The white coating of the metal tines was chipped in places. Then he saw it. Tucked in the back corner, almost hidden by the cutlery basket, was a single small plate. It was white with a generic floral pattern. Devaney leaned in closer, his breath held tight in his chest. On the rim of the plate, visible against the stark white ceramic, was a dried, reddish-brown smudge. A thumbprint. A smudge of pasta sauce? Blood? Clay from the bank roof? And right next to it, the faint, greasy whirls of a friction ridge impression. The cleaner had missed one. Just one. Devaney stared at the plate. It was no longer a piece of ceramic. It was the anchor that would drag the entire crew back from the anonymity of the skies. Devaney said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a gavel strike. Miller didn't move immediately. For a moment, the silence of the suburban rental house seemed to amplify, the hum of the refrigerator compressor kicking on like a distant engine. The younger agent stepped into the kitchen, his shoes squeaking faintly on the linoleum, a jarring sound in the cathedral-like stillness of the crime scene. He looked from Devaney's face, which was set in a grim mask of triumph, down to the open maw of the dishwasher. Miller said, his voice flat, struggling to reconcile the months of dead ends with this sudden, fragile clarity. Devaney stepped back, giving his partner space, though his eyes never left the ceramic disc. Miller leaned in, hands clasped behind his back, a habit drilled into him at Quantico to prevent accidental contamination. He squinted into the gloom of the machine's interior. The dishwasher was a cavern of white plastic and metal wire, a technological sarcophagus that had almost successfully swallowed the evidence. The smudge, Miller acknowledged, straightening up. It's distinct. But Earl, if that's sauce, if it's food residue, the heat of the drying cycle might have baked it into the ridges. It could be distorted, unusable. It's not sauce, Devaney said, the conviction in his voice stemming from a gut instinct that had served him through 20 years of chasing bank robbers across the Midwest. Or if it is, it's mixed with oils, sebaceous residue. Look at the way the light hits the curve. That's a friction ridge. It's a thumb, Miller, a right thumb, planted hard when he was shoving the plate in, probably rushing. Maybe they were arguing. Maybe the lookout car radioed that a patrol was too close. Distraction. That's what kills the pros, not the police. Distraction. Devaney turned away from the dishwasher, the adrenaline beginning to curdle into a methodical, icy focus. Go to the car. Get the kit. The big one. I want the macro lens, I want the fingerprint lifters, and I want the rigid evidence box. Do not, I repeat, do not bring me a paper bag. Miller nodded, the skepticism finally bleeding out of his expression, replaced by the frenetic energy of the hunt. I'm on it. He turned and jogged down the hallway, the front door opening and closing with a heavy thud that vibrated through the floorboards. Left alone, Devaney allowed himself a single deep breath. He inhaled the scent of the kitchen. Beneath the lemon chemical sting of the cleaning products the crew had used to scrub their history away, there was something else. Stale air. Dust. The faint, metallic tang of anxiety that seemed to linger in walls where desperate men had plotted crimes that would make headlines for a decade. He looked around the room, reconstructing the ghosts. James Dincio was here, Devaney thought. He could almost see the phantom of the master thief leaning against the counter. Dincio was a professional's professional, a man who treated burglary like structural engineering. He wouldn't have been relaxed. He would have been pacing,
maybe holding a cup of coffee in that hand, the hand that left the print. Devaney moved to the window, peering through the blinds. The neighborhood was painfully ordinary. Manicured lawns, tricycles on driveways, the mid-afternoon sun baking the asphalt. It was the perfect camouflage. Who looks for the most sophisticated burglary crew in history in a 3-bedroom ranch house in a quiet cul-de-sac? The crew had been smart. They lived like ghosts. They bought their groceries with cash, likely in different towns. They probably never opened the curtains. They slept in shifts, and when the job was done, when the vault at the United California Bank was gutted and $30 million in cash and jewelry was stuffed into duffel bags, they came back here. To wash the dishes. The absurdity of it threatened to make Devaney laugh, but he choked it down. It wasn't funny, it was human.
And that was the fatal flaw in every criminal enterprise.
You could bypass the alarm systems. You could drill through reinforced steel with thermal lances. You could disable the silent triggers. But you couldn't stop being a human being who needed to eat off a plate. Miller returned, breathless, laden with the heavy black case of the crime scene kit. He set it down on the kitchen table, the latches snapping open with a loud clack clack. Devaney ordered. Miller assembled the Nikon, screwing on the heavy macro lens. The mechanical whine of the film advance was the only sound in the room. Flashbulbs were risky with reflective surfaces. They could wash out the detail. Miller adjusted the aperture, using the ambient light from the window, steadying his breathing. Click. Whir. Click. Devaney watched like a hawk. For 20 minutes, they documented the dishwasher. It was tedious, back-breaking work, hunching over the open door, ensuring every shadow was captured. To an outsider, they looked like priests worshipping at a porcelain altar. Devaney said finally, "This was the moment of highest risk. If Miller's hand slipped, if the plate clattered against the rack, the vibration could flake off the dried residue. If he touched the print with his glove, he would overlay his own latex pattern onto the evidence, destroying the integrity of the ridges." Miller pulled on a fresh pair of cotton gloves, then latex over them. He reached in with the delicacy of a surgeon. He bypassed the rim, aiming for the underside of the plate, the center of gravity. Devaney held his breath. Miller's fingers curled around the base. He lifted. The plate came free of the tines without a sound. He drew it back, out of the machine, into the open air of the kitchen. Miller exhaled. Devaney commanded, holding open the rigid cardboard evidence container, lined with foam to prevent movement. Miller lowered the plate. It settled into the foam. Devaney closed the lid and sealed it with red evidence tape. He took a black marker from his pocket and wrote on the label, "Case number 72-194. Loc, kitchen. Item, plate latent. Agent E. Devaney." He signed across the tape, sealing the timeline. The moment the ink dried, the plate ceased to be dinnerware and became a sworn affidavit. Devaney said, the box tucked under his arm like a football. They walked out into the sunlight. The transition was jarring. The world outside was bright, noisy, and oblivious. A mailman was walking up a driveway 3 houses down. A dog was barking. None of them knew that the end game of the largest bank heist in American history was sitting in a cardboard box under Devaney's arm. They got into the bureau sedan, the heat inside the car stifling. Miller started the engine, blasting the air conditioning. "Straight to the lab?" Miller asked, putting the car in gear. "Straight to the lab," Devaney confirmed. "And Miller, drive like you've got a carton of nitroglycerin in the back seat." The drive to the federal building was a blur of highway concrete and heat haze. Devaney sat with the box on his lap, staring out the window but seeing nothing. His mind was racing ahead, playing out the next 6 hours. The fingerprint section would be busy. It was a Friday afternoon. They'd want to go home. He'd have to twist arms. He'd have to call the assistant director if he had to. This couldn't wait until Monday. The trail was already cold. They couldn't let it freeze. "You think it's him?" Miller asked, breaking the silence as they merged onto the interstate. "Dincio?" "It's one of them," Devaney said. "Dincio, his brother, maybe Riley. Or maybe one of the younger guys they brought in for muscle. But it doesn't matter who it is. One domino falls, they all fall. These guys, they're tight, but they're paranoid. Once we ID one, we hit the travel records. We find out who flew in with him. We check the hotels. We unravel the knot. If the print is good, Miller cautioned. The print is good, Devaney said, though a knot of worry tightened in his stomach. He was betting everything on a smudge of grease. They pulled into the underground garage of the federal building, the tires screeching on the polished concrete. Devaney was out of the car before the engine died, marching toward the elevators. Miller scrambled to keep up, grabbing the paperwork. The elevator ride was an eternity. The doors slid open on the 4th floor, forensics and identification. The air here smelled of acetic acid, developing chemicals, and stale cigarette smoke. It was the smell of truth. Devaney bypassed the reception desk, walking straight into the main lab. Rows of technicians stood at long tables, magnifying glasses in hand, comparing ink cards to latent lifts. It was a factory of identity. "Kowalski!" Devaney barked. A balding man in a lab coat looked up from a microscope, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. "Earl, you look like you're about to have a coronary. What do you have?" "I have the case breaker," Devaney said, setting the box down on Kowalski's table gently. "Laguna Niguel job." The room went quiet. Every tech knew about Laguna Niguel. 30 million. The audacity of it. The clean getaway. It was the case everyone wanted a piece of. Kowalski stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "You found something at the safe house? I thought the report said it was scrubbed." "They missed a spot," Devaney said. "Dishwasher, top rack, 1 plate." Kowalski carefully cut the red tape. He opened the box. He didn't touch the plate. He adjusted his desk lamp, swinging the articulated arm down until the bulb was inches from the ceramic. He peered through his magnifying loupe. Devaney and Miller stood behind him, holding their breath. Kowalski murmured, tilting his head. Devaney asked, his voice tight. Kowalski said. Devaney said. Kowalski ushered them back. Devaney said, pulling up a metal stool. Miller looked at Devaney, then at the door. The next hour was an exercise in torture. Devaney watched as Kowalski set up the heavy rostrum camera. He watched the shutter click. He watched Kowalski take the film to the darkroom. He listened to the running water. When Kowalski emerged, holding a dripping 8x10 glossy print, Devaney stood up. The image was stark black and white. The fingerprint, magnified, looked like a topographical map of a mountain range. Every ridge, every pore, every bifurcation was visible. It was a masterpiece of biological evidence. Kowalski said, clipping the photo onto the drying line. Devaney said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed the list to Kowalski. 1. James Dincio. 2. Harry Barber. 3. Amil Dincio. 4. Phil Christopher. 5. Charles Gann, Mulligan. Kowalski took the list. 282, 83, 84. Kowalski disappeared into the records room, a vast archive of rotating metal cabinets, containing the fingerprints of every known felon in the United States. He returned 10 minutes later with a stack of yellowed cards. Kowalski said. He placed the photograph of the plate print on the left side of the comparator, a split-screen device that allowed 2 images to be viewed side by side. On the right side, he slipped in the card for James Dincio. Devaney leaned over Kowalski's shoulder. On the screen, 2 giant fingerprints appeared. Kowalski muttered, adjusting the focus knobs. Devaney felt a physical blow to his chest. Kowalski switched the card. They went through all 10 of James Dincio's fingers. Nothing. Devaney said, his jaw set. Harry Barber. No match. Amil Dincio. No match. The silence in the lab grew heavy. Miller had returned with the coffee, but he didn't dare speak. He just stood by the door, watching Devaney's back get stiffer and stiffer. Phil Christopher, Devaney said. Kowalski slid the card in. He cycled to the right thumb. Wait, Kowalski said. Devaney froze. "I see a bifurcation at 3 o'clock, Kowalski said, zooming in, "and an island ridge at 6 o'clock. He adjusted the alignment, rotating the card slightly to match the angle of the print on the plate. The lines on the screen seemed to flow into one another. The chaotic geography of the crime scene print aligned perfectly with the ordered ink of the police record. "Look at the ridge count," Kowalski whispered. 1, 2, 3, 4, 12 ridges between the delta and the core. He looked up at Devaney. "It's a match, Earl. It's Phil Christopher." Devaney let out a breath that felt like it had been held for 6 months. He closed his eyes for a second, feeling the wave of relief wash over him, followed immediately by the crushing weight of what came next. Phil Christopher, the alarms expert. If Christopher was there, Dincio was there. The Ohio crew was in California. They had the connection. "Print it," Devaney said, his voice low and dangerous. "Print 5 copies. Miller, get to a phone. Call the SAC. Tell him we have a positive ID placing a known bank robber inside the suspected safe house. I want warrants. I want surveillance teams on Christopher's known associates in Cleveland. I want flight manifests for every airline between Cleveland and LAX for the last 3 months." Miller dropped the coffee cup into a trash can. He hadn't taken a sip and ran for the door. Devaney stayed at the comparator, staring at the screen. The 2 fingerprints, side by side, glowed green in the phosphor light. It was beautiful. It was the end of the mystery and the beginning of the war. Kowalski said, lighting a cigarette. Devaney said, straightening his tie. He walked out of the lab, his mind already shifting gears. He wasn't thinking about the plate anymore. He was thinking about Phil Christopher. He was thinking about how a man spends $30 million. He was thinking about the mistakes that come after the success. The plate was just the key. Now he had to open the door. Devaney walked to his desk in the bullpen. The office was buzzing with the late afternoon energy of agents wrapping up their week, discussing weekend plans, baseball scores. They didn't know that the atmosphere was about to change. He sat down and pulled a fresh legal pad from his drawer. He uncapped his pen. Operation Unsub, Laguna, Niguel. Subject, Philip Aldo Christopher. He underlined the name 3 times. The phone on his desk rang. It was Miller. Quote 304. Devaney picked up the receiver. Quote 305. A click. Then the booming voice of the special agent in charge. Quote 306. Quote 307. Devaney said, his voice steady as a rock. Quote 308. There was a pause on the other end. Quote 309. Quote 310. Devaney said. Quote 311. Quote 312. Devaney hung up. He looked around the office. The fluorescent lights hummed. The typewriters clattered. He thought about the plate again. The single small plate in the back of the dishwasher. He wondered who had put it there. Was it Christopher? Was he tired? Lazy? Or was it just the random chaos of the universe, entropy asserting itself against the perfect plan? It didn't matter, the mistake was made. Devaney stood up and grabbed his jacket. He walked to the chalkboard at the front of the room, where the timeline of the heist was sketched out in vague terms. He picked up an eraser and wiped away the question mark next to suspects. In bold white chalk he wrote, "The Ohio Crew." He turned to the room. "Listen up!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the chatter. The room went silent. 30 heads turned. "Cancel your weekends," Devaney said. "We're going to Cleveland." The flight to Cleveland was rough, the plane shuddering through a storm front that stretched across the Midwest. Devaney stared out into the blackness, his reflection ghostly in the plexiglass. Miller was asleep in the seat next to him, head lolling against the window, exhausted by the adrenaline crash. Devaney couldn't sleep. His mind was a Rolodex of facts and faces. Phil Christopher, a family man in his own twisted way, connected to the mob, but independent enough to run with Dincio. A man who liked the good life. He wouldn't be hiding in a hole, he'd be flashing the cash. That would be his second mistake. The plate was the first, the money would be the second. They landed at Hopkins International shortly after midnight. The rain was driving sideways, slicking the tarmac. A team from the Cleveland field office was waiting for them at the gate. 3 agents in trench coats, looking unhappy about the hour, but eager for the case. The lead agent asked. He was a big man with a broken nose, introduced as Agent Rossi. Devaney smiled grimly. Rossi asked. Devaney said. They drove in a convoy to the surveillance van, parked 3 blocks from Christopher's house, in a quiet, affluent suburb. The rain drummed rhythmically on the metal roof of the van. Inside, it smelled of coffee and ozone from the electronic listening gear. Devaney put on a headset. Anything?
Quiet so far, the tech said. Just household noises. TV was on earlier. Now, nothing. Devaney settled in for the wait. He was good at waiting. Patience was the detective's primary weapon. More useful than a gun or a badge. You waited for the slip. You waited for the phone call. At 2 a.m., the reel-to-reel tape recorder clicked on. A phone was being dialed inside the house. Devaney pressed the headphones tighter against his ears. Ring, ring. 327. A voice answered, gruff, sleepy. 328, came the voice from the house. Phil Christopher. Devaney recognized the cadence from old wiretaps. 329. 330. The other voice snapped. 331. Jimmy. James Dincio. Devaney signaled to Miller, who was instantly awake. He pointed to the notepad. Dincio confirmed. Dincio said on the tape. 333, Christopher asked. Devaney's heart hammered against his ribs. It was almost telepathic. The guilt, the nagging doubt of the subconscious. Dincio hissed. Click. Devaney took off the headset. He looked at the agents huddled in the van. Devaney ordered. The trace came back in 20 minutes. A townhouse on the east side of the city. Miller whispered. Devaney said. For 3 days, Devaney lived in the van. He shaved in gas station bathrooms. He ate stale donuts. He watched Phil Christopher mow his lawn. He watched him drive the new Cadillac to the grocery store. It was maddeningly normal. But on the 4th day, the pattern broke. Christopher left his house at 10 a.m. He didn't go to the grocery store. He drove to a diner on the outskirts of the city. Devaney and Miller trailed him in an unmarked sedan, staying 2 cars back. Christopher parked and went inside. 5 minutes later, another car pulled up. A Lincoln Continental. 2 men got out. Devaney recognized them instantly from the mugshots. Emil Dincio and James Dincio. Jackpot, Miller breathed. Not yet, Devaney said. Wait! A 3rd car arrived. Harry Barber. They were all there, the entire board of directors of the Laguna Niguel heist, sitting in a greasy spoon diner in Ohio, likely discussing how to launder the biggest score of their lives. Rossi, Devaney radioed to the backup units. All subjects are present. Confirm visual. Visual confirmed, Rossi's voice crackled. Devaney watched through binoculars. He saw James Dincio laughing, slapping the table. They felt safe. They thought they had won. They thought the distance between California and Ohio was a shield. They didn't know that a dirty plate had bridged the gap. Give them 5 minutes, Devaney said. Let them get comfortable. I want them to be surprised. He checked his service revolver, a reflex more than a necessity. This wasn't going to be a shootout. These men were professionals. They knew when they were beaten. This was going to be a takedown. Devaney said, putting the car in gear. The unmarked cars swarmed the parking lot. Sirens wailed, shattering the morning calm. Agents poured out, weapons drawn, jackets emblazoned with FBI. Devaney hit the door of the diner just as the bell chimed. The table in the back froze. James Dincio had a fork halfway to his mouth. Phil Christopher looked up, his face draining of color. They didn't reach for guns, they just stared. Devaney walked up to the table. He didn't yell. He didn't flip the table. He just stood there, looming over them, the weary weight of the investigation finally lifting from his shoulders. He looked directly at Phil Christopher. You should have checked the dishwasher, Phil, Devaney said softly. Christopher closed his eyes. He knew. In that split second, he understood exactly how the world had collapsed on top of him. James Dincio, you are under arrest for the burglary of the United California Bank, Miller announced, reading the rights. As the cuffs clicked onto Dincio's wrists, The mastermind looked at Devaney. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a cold, professional curiosity. "How?" Dincio asked. "We wore gloves. We burned the clothes. We scrubbed the floors." "Entropy," Devaney said, echoing his own thoughts from days ago. "The physical world is messy, James. You can't control everything." They led them out in a line, the super thieves of the headlines reduced to men in handcuffs, shielding their faces from the sudden onslaught of press cameras that seemed to materialize out of the ether. Devaney leaned against the hood of his car, watching the scene. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a profound exhaustion. It was over. The paperwork would take years. The trials would be a circus, but the hunt was done. Miller walked over, handing Devaney a lit cigarette. "Good work, boss," Miller said. Devaney took a drag, the smoke harsh in his lungs. He looked at his hand. He thought about the ridges on his own fingers, the unique signature that defined his existence, just as it defined Christopher's. Devaney said, exhaling a plume of blue smoke. Miller grinned. Devaney nodded. He looked up at the grey Ohio sky. Somewhere back in California, in a sterile evidence locker, a cheap white plate with a floral pattern sat in a box. It was a monument to human error, a reminder that no matter how smart you are, no matter how perfect the plan, you still have to do the dishes. Devaney said, tossing the cigarette onto the wet pavement. He opened the car door but paused. He looked back at the diner one last time. The waitress was clearing the table where the thieves had sat. She picked up a coffee cup, wiped the table with a rag, and carried the dishes back to the kitchen. Devaney watched her go. He whispered to himself. Then he got in the car, and they drove away. Devaney dropped the heavy stack of guest registration cards onto the laminate table. The sound was a dull, flat thud that seemed to absorb the ambient noise of the makeshift command center. He did not sit down. He picked up the first card, a yellowed 3x5 index slip from the quote 369 quote in Newport Beach. He scanned the name, the address, and the license plate number listed. Then he passed it to the agent on his left. Quote 370, Devaney said. Quote 371. Miller, sitting across the table, rubbed his eyes. The room smelled of stale coffee and carbon paper. Quote 372. Quote 373, Devaney corrected, his voice level. Quote 374. The investigation into the Laguna Niguel vault breach had moved from the physical wreckage of the bank to the paper trails of Southern California's hospitality industry. The thieves had vanished, but they had lived somewhere for 3 days. They had slept, eaten, and driven cars. Devaney knew that the logistics of a burglary this size required a base of operations. The vault roof had been breached with hundreds of pounds of equipment. That equipment had to be stored. Devaney walked to the corkboard where a map of Orange County was pinned. He picked up a red pushpin. Devaney stated. He pushed the pin into the location of the bank. Devaney said. Miller picked up a ledger from a rental agency in Dana Point. Devaney froze. He turned slowly from the board. Miller said. Devaney walked over and took the ledger. The handwriting was slanted sharply to the right. The H in Hamilton had a distinctive loop, a flourish that seemed practiced but hurried. Devaney said quietly. He walked to a separate file cabinet, the one labeled Historical/Ohio. He pulled a dossier from a raid 3 years prior, a safe deposit box fraud case out of Youngstown. He flipped to a photocopy of a car rental agreement. The name on the old rental was different, Anthony Molina, but the slant was identical. The M had the same loop as the H. Quote 384, Devaney said. He placed the two documents side by side. Quote 385. Miller stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Quote 386. Quote 387, Devaney ordered. Quote 388. The townhouse at Vista del Niguel was clean. It was a generic beige unit with views of the rolling hills that separated the suburbs from the ocean. The air inside was stale, trapped by windows that hadn't been opened in months. Devaney stood in the center of the living room. The furniture was rental grade, stiff sofas, a glass coffee table, bare walls.
The cleaning crew had obviously been through after the lease ended.
"The landlord says they were quiet,"
Miller reported, walking in from the hallway. "Said they were businessmen looking to invest in real estate. They left the place spotless, got their full deposit back." Devaney put on a fresh pair of latex gloves. "Nobody leaves a place spotless. Physics doesn't allow it." He moved to the kitchen. This was the operational heart of any safe house. Men under stress ate, they drank, they paced. He opened the refrigerator. Empty, wiped down with ammonia. He could still smell the faint chemical sting. He checked the trash compactor. New bag. The interior mechanism had been scrubbed. Devaney knelt on the linoleum floor. He looked at the baseboards. No dust. They had been thorough. This confirmed it was the Dincio crew. An amateur thief leaves beer bottles and pizza boxes. A professional cleans the baseboards. "They wiped the surfaces," Devaney muttered. "Countertops, handles, knobs." He stood up and looked at the dishwasher. It was a standard white appliance, built into the cabinetry. "Miller!" Devaney called out. Miller appeared in the doorway. "Yeah, boss? Did the cleaning service run the dishwasher?" "Landlord said the tenants did. Said they ran a load before they left." Devaney stared at the machine. It was a psychological blind spot. You wipe the things you touch to make them dirty. You don't wipe the machine that makes things clean. The assumption of sterility creates a gap in the security protocol. Devaney reached out and unlatched the door. He pulled it open. The racks slid out with a metallic rattle. The interior was dry. It smelled of detergent and heat. Devaney leaned in close. He looked at the white plastic coating of the bottom rack. He looked at the stainless steel interior of the door. Then he saw it. On the side of the detergent dispenser, a small rectangular cup on the inside of the door, there was a faint, greasy smudge. It wasn't visible straight on, but under the oblique light from the kitchen window, the ridges caught the glare. Someone had loaded the detergent. They had pressed their thumb against the cup to snap the lid shut. "Miller," Devaney said, his voice dropping an octave. "Dust the dispenser." Miller stepped forward, his kit already open. He pulled out a brush and a jar of black powder. "You think it survived the wash cycle?" "The heat sets it," Devaney said. "If the water didn't hit it directly, the heat from the drying cycle bakes the oils onto the plastic. It preserves it." Miller carefully applied the powder. He blew gently. A partial print emerged. It was a whorl, distinct and clear against the white plastic. "It's a right thumb," Miller said. "High quality." Devaney didn't smile. He stared at the ridges. That tiny pattern, less than an inch of oil and sweat, was the only thing connecting the millions of dollars stolen to the men who stole it. Devaney commanded. 3 days later, the FBI field office in Los Angeles was humming with the low-frequency tension that precedes a takedown. The administrative trace had been exhaustive. Devaney sat at his desk, the phone receiver pressed to his ear. He was on the line with the latent print unit in D.C. The voice on the other end said. The tone was dry, bureaucratic, devoid of drama. Devaney held his breath. He looked out the window at the parking lot, watching the heat ripple off the asphalt. "Devaney said," the examiner said. Devaney closed his eyes for a second. The image of the townhouse kitchen flashed in his mind. The sterile counters, the wiped handles, the one mistake. Devaney asked, though he already knew. The examiner said. Devaney exhaled. The air left his lungs in a long, slow release. The ghost was real. The Hamilton alias, the flight records, the vague descriptions, it all collapsed into a single, undeniable fact. Devaney said, the examiner said. Devaney hung up the phone. He stood up and walked to the center of the bullpen. The room went quiet. Agents stopped typing. Miller looked up from a stack of subpoenas. Devaney announced, his voice carried to the back of the room. A ripple of energy went through the room, a collective shifting of posture. The hunt had changed. It was no longer a mystery. It was a pursuit. Devaney said, buttoning his jacket. Miller walked over, a grin breaking through his exhaustion. Devaney said, picking up his car keys. The energy in the bullpen didn't dissipate. It calcified, hardening into a grim, mechanical resolve. Devaney didn't bask in the breakthrough. For a man like Earl Devaney, The moment the puzzle was solved was the moment the real work, the dangerous work, began. The intellectual challenge of the vault was over. Now came the kinetic challenge of the street. He moved toward the large corkboard that dominated the eastern wall of the office, a collage of grainy surveillance photos, architectural blueprints of the United California Bank, and typed lists of flight manifests. He picked up a red marker. With a decisive, squeaking stroke, he circled the name Amil Dincio and drew a sharp line connecting it to the photograph of the townhouse kitchen. He did the same for James. Devaney said, not turning around. Miller said, already pulling files, his fatigue replaced by the sharp, electric hum of the chase. Devaney walked back to his office, the glass-walled enclosure that offered a view of his agents scrambling. He sat down and pulled a fresh legal pad from his drawer. He began to draft the strategy for the Cleveland leg of the operation. This wasn't going to be a simple knock and talk. The Dincios were not common thieves. They were the aristocracy of the burglary world, and they were embedded deep within the ecosystem of the Youngstown mob. Going into Youngstown to pull out the Dincio brothers was like reaching into a beehive to extract a specific drone without getting stung by the thousands of others protecting the nest. He dialed the number for the special agent in charge in Cleveland. The connection clicked and hissed with the distance. "Devaney," the voice answered. It was SAC Reynolds, a man whose voice sounded like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. "We have them, Bob," Devaney said. "Positive ID on the prints. It's the Dincios, both of them." There was a silence on the line, heavy and contemplative. Reynolds knew what this meant. It meant the quiet war against the Ohio crews was about to go loud. "You sure, Earl? Youngstown isn't a place for guesswork. If we kick down Amel's door and come up empty, the fallout will be nuclear. The Bureau can't afford a harassment suit from the mob right now." 12-point match on James, partial on Amil. "It's ironclad," Devaney said, his voice dropping an octave. "We found them in the rental property they used as a staging ground. They washed the dishes, Bob, but they missed a spot on the detergent cup. It's the only mistake they made in 6 months of planning, but it's enough." "All right," Reynolds said, the reluctance leaving his voice, replaced by command presence. "When are you landing?" "I'm booking the next flight out. I'm bringing Miller and 2 others. I want a task force ready when we hit the tarmac. We need 24-hour eyes on Amel's place, James's place, and any known associates. But do not, I repeat, do not spook them. If they smell a tail, they'll bury that money so deep we'll need a drilling rig to find it. The money is the second half of the conviction. We need the cash. We'll have the surveillance teams in unmarked cars, disguised as utility vehicles," Reynolds replied. "Standard rotation. We've got a new listening post we can set up near Emil's residence, but the neighborhood is tight, insular. A stranger walks a dog down the wrong street in that part of Youngstown, and 5 phones ring before he hits the corner." "I know," Devaney said. "That's why we need to move fast. Keep it tight, Bob. I'll see you in 6 hours." Devaney hung up and rubbed his temples. The adrenaline was beginning to mix with the sleep deprivation, creating a jagged, surreal clarity. He looked at the window again. The Los Angeles sun was beginning to dip, casting long, golden shadows across the parking lot. It looked peaceful. It was a lie. Somewhere in Ohio, amidst the soot and the steel mills, $30 million, some in cash, most in untraceable bonds and jewelry, was sitting in a trunk, or a basement, or a safety deposit box. He stood and grabbed his coat. He checked his sidearm, a reflex honed by 20 years of service, and walked out to the bullpen. "Pack your bags," he told the room. "We're going to the Rust Belt." The flight east was a blur of pressurized air and darkness. Devaney spent the hours reviewing the profiles of the Youngstown crew. Emil Dincio, the mastermind, a man who treated burglary like engineering. He didn't blow doors, he dismantled them. He bypassed alarms with a surgeon's touch. He was disciplined, sober, and ruthlessly efficient. He was the kind of criminal Devaney begrudgingly respected, a professional. James was the muscle, the support, the loyal soldier, but Emil was the architect. When the plane touched down in Cleveland, the air that greeted them on the tarmac was heavy, humid, and smelled faintly of industrial exhaust, a stark contrast to the dry heat of Southern California. It was the smell of the Midwest, of hard labor and old money and hidden corruption. Reynolds was waiting for them at the field office, a squat brick building that felt more like a fortress than an office. The conference room was already prepped. Maps of Youngstown were taped to the walls, streets highlighted in yellow, known mob hangouts marked in red. Reynolds said, shaking his hand, "He looks tired." Everyone looked tired. Devaney poured a cup of the black sludge and took a seat at the head of the table. A local agent named Harrison reported. He was young, eager, wearing a suit that was slightly too large for him. Devaney corrected sharply. Devaney stood and walked to the map of Youngstown. He traced the route from the airport to the city. He said, half to himself. He took. Miller chimed in, shuffling his papers. Miller paused, his eyes scanning the dot matrix printout. Devaney turned, his eyes narrowing. Reynolds said. Devaney said. The stakeout began the next morning. It was a grinding, monotonous war of attrition. Devaney sat in the passenger seat of a nondescript Ford sedan parked 2 blocks down from Emil Dincio's sprawling suburban home. The house was nice, too nice for a man with no legitimate income that anyone could trace. It sat back on a manicured lawn, projecting an image of upper-middle-class respectability. Devaney watched through a pair of high-powered binoculars. The curtains were drawn. Fordeni murmured. The agent beside him, a Cleveland veteran named Kowalski, muttered. Devaney said. A garage door opened. Devaney stiffened. A sleek Cadillac backed out of the driveway. Emil Dincio was behind the wheel. He wore large sunglasses and a polo shirt. He looked relaxed. Devaney spoke into the radio handset. The pursuit was a slow-motion dance through the streets of Youngstown. Devaney's car hung back, allowing a blue Chevy Nova from the surveillance team to take the lead, then swapping out with a panel van a mile later. They tracked Emil past the steel mills, where the sky turned a bruised purple from the smoke, and into the commercial district. Emil pulled into a diner. He got out, looked around casually, too casually, and went inside. Quote 467, Devaney said. 468. 469, Kowalski asked. 4470. They sat in the sweltering car for 45 minutes. Devaney watched the diner. He saw Emil sitting in a booth, drinking coffee. Alone. No contacts. No bag drop. Kowalski asked. Devaney realized. 473. Suddenly, a second car pulled into the lot. A Lincoln Continental. James Dincio stepped out. Fevin 4, Devaney whispered. James entered the diner and sat opposite his brother. They didn't shake hands. They didn't hug. They leaned in close. Devaney radioed the team who had set up inside the diner, disguised as patrons. Miller's voice came through the earpiece, tinny and laced with static. Inside the diner, Miller strained to hear over the sounds of clattering plates and a heavy bass line thumping from the record player. He sipped his coffee, staring into the dark liquid as if it were a crystal ball. Emil's voice drifted over, low and gravelly. James said. Emil snapped. Miller scribbled notes on a napkin, hiding his hand under the table. Admission of possession. Conspiracy to launder. It was gold. Outside, Devaney watched the brothers argue. He saw the tension in James's shoulders, the commanding finger point of Emil. The dynamic was fracturing. The pressure of the stolen fortune was weighing on them. Devaney noted, the meeting lasted 20 minutes. The brothers parted ways, driving off in opposite directions. Kowalski asked. Devaney said, the days turned into a week. The surveillance became a lifestyle. The agents lived on fast food and caffeine, sleeping in shifts in the safe house they'd established in a vacant rental property 3 streets over from Emil's. The house was filled with telephoto lenses on tripods, reel-to-reel tape recorders, and overflowing ashtrays. They mapped the Dincio network. They identified the cousins, the nephews, the friends who might be holding parcels of cash. They began to see the invisible web that held the Youngstown underworld together. But they still didn't have the money, and without the money, a jury might hesitate.
A defense lawyer could argue the fingerprints on the dishwasher were circumstantial. Maybe they visited the house but didn't rob the bank. Devaney needed the smoking gun. Then the break came from an unexpected angle. The phone in the safe house rang at 3 a.m. Devaney, sleeping on a cot in the corner, was awake before the second ring. He rasped. The voice said. Devaney sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the cot. Devaney said, his mind racing. Devaney said, looking at the map on the wall. Devaney hung up and woke the room. Miller groaned, rubbing his eyes. The arrest of Harry Barber was surgical. They caught him leaving his house at dawn, carrying a briefcase. Inside the briefcase were $10,000 in stolen travelers' checks and a handgun. In the interrogation room, Barber lasted less than an hour. He was an old man, tired of the life, and looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary scared him more than Emil Dincio did. "I didn't do the job," Barber pleaded, his hands shaking as he smoked a cigarette. "I just took the paper. Emil gave it to me. He said it was clean." "Emil Dincio lied to you, Harry," Devaney said, leaning across the metal table. "He gave you the dirty paper to see if you'd get caught. You were the canary in the coal mine. And guess what? The canary just died." Barber's face fell. He realized the truth of it. He had been used. "Where is the rest of it, Harry?" Devaney asked softly. "Give us the rest, and we can talk to the prosecutor about your cooperation." "He buried it," Barber whispered, "behind the house. He's got PVC pipes buried in the backyard, filled with jewelry. The cash is in the attic, in the walls." Devaney stood up. He walked out of the interrogation room and looked at Miller and Reynolds. "Get the warrants," Devaney said. "We're taking down the house." The raid on Emil Dincio's house was executed with overwhelming force. At 0600 hours, a convoy of FBI sedans and local police cruisers swarmed Country Club Drive. Devaney was in the lead car. He stepped out onto the damp grass, his badge displayed on his chest pocket, a megaphone in his hand. "FBI!" he shouted, his voice shattering the morning quiet. "Emil Dincio, come out with your hands up. We have a warrant for your arrest." For a long moment, nothing happened. The house stood silent, indifferent. Then, a light flickered on the second floor. A curtain moved. "Rear team, hold your positions," Devaney commanded into his radio. "He might try the back." The front door opened slowly. Emil Dincio stepped out. He was wearing a silk robe and slippers. He looked annoyed, not frightened. He looked at the sea of agents, the shotguns, the flak jackets. He looked at Devaney. He smiled a thin, cold smile. "You're making a lot of noise for this hour of the morning," Emil called out. "Put your hands on your head and walk to the street," Devaney ordered. Emil complied. As the agents moved in to cuff him, Devaney walked up. They stood face to face. The architect of the greatest bank burglary in history and the man who had hunted him down. "You missed a spot," Devaney said quietly. Emil looked at him, confusion flickering in his dark eyes. "What?" "The dishwasher. You wiped everything, Emil. The counters, the handles, the fridge. But you forgot the dishwasher detergent cup. That's how we found you." Emil's expression didn't change, but the color drained from his face. The realization hit him. The triviality of it, the absurdity. Emil muttered. Devaney signaled. As they led Emil away, the search teams poured into the house. It took them 3 hours. They found the hollowed-out walls in the attic. They found the stacks of cash, still wrapped in the bank bands from Laguna Niguel. They dug up the backyard and found the PVC pipes stuffed with diamonds and gold watches. Miller came out of the house carrying a duffel bag, grinning like a child on Christmas. Miller said. Devaney looked at the house, then at the sky. The tension that had lived in his spine for months began to dissolve, replaced by a profound exhaustion. Devaney said. Miller asked. Devaney said, turning toward the car. But the sleep didn't come. Not really. The trial preparation began almost immediately. The sheer volume of evidence required months of cataloguing. Devaney found himself living in the witness prep rooms, going over the minutiae of the fingerprint analysis, the flight logs,
the rental agreements. The trial of the Dincio brothers was a spectacle. The media dubbed it the super thief trial. The courtroom was packed every day. Devaney sat at the prosecution table, watching Emil Dincio. Emil sat with a rigid dignity, whispering to his lawyers, taking notes. He still believed he could outsmart the system. He believed that if he could just find the right loophole, the right technicality, the walls would dissolve. But the evidence was a brick wall. The fingerprint was the cornerstone. When the expert from the latent print unit took the stand and projected the image of the latent print next to Emil's inked card, a hush fell over the room. The ridges and walls matched perfectly. It was mathematics.
It was undeniable.
Devaney took the stand on the fourth day. He recounted the investigation with clinical precision. He described the hole in the roof, the bypassed alarms, the eerie emptiness of the vault. He described the townhouse. "Agent Devaney," the defense attorney asked on cross-examination, trying to find a crack in the armor, "is it not possible that my client simply visited the townhouse? That he was a guest? That his presence there does not prove he was in the bank?" "He was there under an assumed name," Devaney replied calmly. "He rented the getaway vehicle under an alias, and we found the stolen bonds in the walls of his home. The fingerprint puts him in the command center of the operation. The money puts the operation in his pocket."
The jury didn't hesitate. The guilty verdicts came down like a hammer blow.
Emil and James Dincio were sentenced to long federal prison terms. The quote, 543 had ended in a cage. 6 months later, Earl Devaney sat in his office in Los Angeles. The case files were boxed up, archived in the deep storage of the federal bureaucracy. The frantic energy of the hunt had faded, replaced by the steady hum of new cases, new names, new crimes. Miller walked in, dropping a file on Devaney's desk. "5," Miller said. Devaney looked at the file. He didn't open it immediately. He was thinking about the dishwasher. He was thinking about the fragility of perfection. "You know," Devaney said, looking up at Miller, "Emil Dincio was a genius, in his own way. He solved problems that bank security experts said were unsolvable. He defeated the sensors. He defeated the concrete." "But he didn't defeat human nature," Miller said.
"No," Devaney agreed. "He got comfortable. He thought he was invisible.
That's what catches them, Miller. Not the badge, not the gun. It's the arrogance. They always forget that someone has to do the dishes." Devaney opened the new file. He picked up his pen. "All right," he said, "let's get to work." The sun continued to beat down on the asphalt outside, just as it had the day the call came from Washington. The cycle continued. The names changed, the crimes changed, but the game remained the same. There was always a lock. There was always someone trying to pick it. And there was always someone like Earl Devaney, waiting in the shadows, listening for the click. He pulled the first photograph out of the Gardena file. It showed a shattered windshield and a sprawling intersection. Chaos. Devaney took a deep breath, the scent of old paper and coffee grounding him. He began to write. The hunt was on again. The weeks following the sentencing saw a shift in the Bureau's atmosphere. The Laguna Niguel case became a case study at Quantico. It was the gold standard for a multi-jurisdictional task force. Devaney found himself receiving calls from agents in New York, Chicago, and Miami, asking for advice on long-term surveillance of organized crews. He answered them patiently, but his mind often drifted back to the quiet moments of the investigation, the waiting, the silence. One Tuesday, a letter arrived on his desk. It was postmarked from the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. The return address was just a number and a name, a Dincio. Devaney stared at the envelope. He used a letter opener to slit the top, extracting a single sheet of lined paper. The handwriting was precise, slanted, elegant. Agent Devaney, I have had time to think. Time is all I have now. I replay the steps, the roof, the alarm, the schedule. I replay it 1,000 times. You think you caught me because you are smart. You are not smarter than me. You are just more patient. You are a grinder. You grind the stone until it is dust. I respect the work, but know this. No vault is truly safe. Someone will build a better one, and someone like me will find the crack. It is the nature of things. You build walls, we build ladders. Enjoy your victory, but check your own dishes. A.D. Devaney folded the letter. A chill ran down his spine, despite the warmth of the office. It was a threat, perhaps, or maybe just an acknowledgement from one professional to another across the chasm of the law. He opened his desk drawer and dropped the letter inside, placing it next to his badge. 553. Devaney muttered to himself. He smiled, a dry, humorless twitch of the lips. He picked up the phone and dialed Miller's extension. Quote, 554, he said, when the younger agent answered. 555. 56, Miller asked. 557, Devaney said. 58. He hung up the phone and turned back to the window. The city of Los Angeles stretched out before him, a vast grid of concrete and ambition hiding a million secrets. Somewhere out there, another crew was planning another job. Somewhere, a blueprint was being unrolled. Somewhere, a timer was being set. Earl Devaney adjusted his tie, leaned back in his chair, and watched the city. He was ready. The phone rang again. It was the SAC. Quote, 559. Quote, the voice crackled. Quote, 560. Quote, Devaney said. Quote, 561. Quote, 562, Devaney said. He stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked out of the office. He didn't look back at the corkboard. The Dincio circle was closed. The line was drawn. It was time to draw a new one. As he walked through the bullpen, the hum of the office seemed to synchronize with his footsteps. The typewriters, the phones, the low murmur of voices. It was the music of the bureau. And Devaney was the conductor. He pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out into the California sunlight. The heat hit him, familiar and intense. He put on his sunglasses. "Let's go," he said to the empty air. The chase never ended, and Earl Devaney wouldn't have it any other way.